When I first saw gameplay of Jedi Fallen Order in early 2019, I flippantly dismissed it as a Star Wars themed ripoff of Dark Souls. However, when I received it as a Christmas gift and finally decided to give it a go, I was very pleasantly surprised by how great the game was. It certainly pulls inspiration from games I love like Dark Souls, Metroid, and Zelda, but it doesn't rip them off either. Rather, it cleverly introduces its own spin to things that makes it feel reminiscent of those games, but is still very markedly its own thing. True to action game form, Fallen Order has plenty of boss fights to rank, so of course we're going to cover them. Here's our ranking of the bosses of Jedi Fallen Order ranked from worst to best.
Rabbit Jotaz isn't inherently terrible, more so he's got a couple of overbearing issues that I'll explain individually. Point 1. While minor, the run-up is unreasonably long. In my opinion, mini-bosses should never even have run-ups, and a meditation spot right outside would do no harm. Point 2. Dial down on the unblockables. There's a few bosses, including this one, that I won't name yet but will make a point of, that incessantly depend on unblockable attacks to cover their moveset. Mixing these in with aggressive and long-chained combos magnifies the nuisance and makes for a bad time. And lastly, point 3. Why does this guy hit so hard? Like many of the reskins and larger bosses of the game, the damage output is unbalanced and makes luck a factor, and even though a solid third of the game's bosses feature this flaw as well, the Rabbit Jotaz stands out as flagrant. But with a bit of luck and well-timed dodges, you can comfortably beat him and come out confident knowing you've toppled the worst this game has to offer.
Most people's first impression of this game's boss quality will either come from the ATST or Ogdo Bogdo. And while the ATST is hardly a heart pounder, I pity the sorry souls who squared off against Ogdo Bogdo on the first visit to Bogano. If you're anything like me, Ogdo was helping himself to your Force Echoes like candy. The biggest reason I and many others found him hard at first is the mindset I alluded to in the introduction of treating this game just like Dark Souls. By this, I mean trying to roll to dodge every attack. In Fallen Order, this is, for the most part, an easy way to find yourself decomposing in Ogdo's stomach. Once you realize that blocking and parrying is generally the way to go in this game, he gets much easier. He still does hefty damage for early game, but becomes more manageable with this in mind. He's pretty low on our list simply because he's an obnoxious pain in the ass if you fight him early, and a boring pushover if you fight him late. There's no stage in the game I can really point to in particular that Ogdo Bogdo seems to be balanced for progression-wise. And I've got to point out that he, like the other three beast bosses, is a reskin of a normal enemy, which is something I'll never understand developers doing. Respawn would have been better off just leaving a normal Ogdo to guard a treasure instead of sullying their overall boss quality with this zero-effort reskin schlock.
The security droid is just another enemy, however, the Imperial Refinery mini-boss stands out due to it being a plot device. The fight itself is intrinsic motivation from Cal's perspective, whether it be to free innocent Wookiees from Imperial slavery, or to free them only to send them back to fight with Saw's rebels. But excusing that, the KX series is melee, melee, melee. Block his backhanded swings, roll through the unblockables, and free the Wookiees. On a bit of a side note, it's neat how these exact Wookiees, along with other species, were the same ones that made Vader question the Empire's ethics and direction for the Death Star's construction. This led him to confront the Imperial slave trade issue directly to his master and Emperor of the Galaxy, Palpatine himself. Of course, Palpatine then lied to Vader, making it seem under control and humane, and thus denying Vader's request. And as little meaning as this mini-boss or scene have to the overall lore of Star Wars, they connect and lead into one of the few instances of Anakin's personality coming into fruition before Vader's discovery of Luke.
As the beast bosses go, I'd say this one was far less offensive than the Rabbit Jotaz or Ogdo Bogdo. While those were reskins of obnoxious enemies, this guy is a reskin of a pretty decent one. To be completely honest, the best part of this fight is that he has a massive nutsack you can wallop. I mentioned this in my Metroid Prime 2 boss ranking, but any boss that has a testicle-like appendage that you can beat up is automatically more amusing. I wasn't fortunate enough to pull this off, but Jack got some nice nut-slashing action in, as you can see here. All it really does is fire webs at you in charge, just like the typical enemy variant. You can usually button mash out of the webs if you get caught, but it's still better to avoid altogether. This fight is incredibly lazy, but it's still somewhat enjoyable regardless.
Sure, it's yet another insignificant mini-boss that exists solely for game length, but I still think the ATST is solid. It's got twin repeating laser cannons that are deflectable but do meager damage in comparison to leg shots, plus a missile launcher and concussion grenade launcher, staying true to the original 1983 Chicken Walker. I really enjoyed this for what it was. To be honest, I wish Respawn included more Imperial vehicle encounters, like maybe an ATDP or an ITT. Honestly, I just love the look of Imperial designs, and the ATST is a classic, so I'd say Respawn nailed this fight for what it's worth.
This is my favorite of the beast bosses simply because he's bar none the easiest. I had more difficulty locating the strangely obscure soundtrack for this game for the video than I did putting this goon 6 feet under. He does pitiful damage and I shredded about 70% of his health in 10 seconds. He does nothing but jump around and swing on occasion, but that's fine by me. I'd much rather just beat up a pushover than get my face shoved in my own piss for 10 minutes like with the Jotaz. He's lame, sure, but at least he isn't a hassle, which is more than the other beast bosses can say.
The Haxian Brood Bounty Droid is a walking, talking, unblockable attack. Parry the lasers when you can, and otherwise roll till the sky falls. Every one of its melee swings are unparryable, so work with what you can. Take advantage of Force Slow and utilize Split Sabers, and this will be over quick.
As unwinnable tutorial bosses go, this one is pretty solid. It's not just a boring one-sided beatdown, and you can actually attack her and block her normally enough, which I appreciate. The setting of the Braca shipbreaking yard is a really nice one, and the Second Sister just looks really cool in general, too. Of all the Second Sister fights, this is by far the shortest, and there isn't much to speak of beyond a few typical lightsaber swings. However, by virtue of being a lightsaber duel, it's automatically cooler than the stuff below it. So even if it's barely a fight, it's still better than slashing up robots and reskins.
The first of many Haxian Brood encounters for most, the Bounty Hunter is pretty fun. But as is the case for all the mini-bosses of Fallen Order, easy is an understatement. Blocking 2 of 3 lasers in a volley sends him harpooning to the floor, and otherwise he really has nothing else going for him. Avoid the occasional rocket and enjoy the hunk of XP.
Oddly enough, the most difficulty Jack and I had deciding on this joint list was deciding if the Commando or Bounty Hunter was the better of the Haxian Brood goons. We ultimately decided to put the Commando as the top of the syndicate, since as far as bosses go in terms of moves, he's probably packing the most variety and nuance. Like the Bounty Hunters, the Commandos tend to bring a buddy along for the ride, which makes it a bit more engaging than it would be otherwise. The randomly generated names crack me up too. In my case, I was thrust into Mortal Kombat with the dreaded D.Erpip, and a helper that I killed before even learning his name. The Commando is sort of a jack of all trades, with a melee shield bash, flashbangs, and some blaster shots to round out a moveset meant for any range. I wouldn't say they're too tricky, but they do a good job of keeping you on your toes, which is fun. I do wish the shield bash attack was easier to dodge though, I suck at that for some reason.
Three words: scripted, story, slow. It's too bad that nearly every sequence featuring the Second Sister / Trilla is either a cutscene or predestined engagement. The prime example being your fights on Zepho and Bogano. If Respawn had gone with 3 Inquisitors like Season 2 of Rebels, the whole complexion of Trilla, the Holocron, Seer, and the Inquisitors in general would have been a lot different. There's actually 2 unnamed Inquisitors from the comics, so they had the option, but as is, Trilla as a character is like a more important MacGuffin. These fights in specific are repetitive and barely flesh out her moveset. I'll let Alex handle the Force Slow point, but yeah, she gets majorly bitched by it, so if you're struggling, get the Stim Canister Refills Force upgrade and have a blast. However, I do appreciate these fights for their story importance. The Zepho one detailed her background as Seer's apprentice, but I'd say the fight over the Holocron within the Bogano Vault was much more meaningful. It had such extreme value to the overall story of Star Wars in terms of who's actually on that list and what would have happened if Vader had gotten it. Obviously, those are all hypotheticals since Cal broke the damn thing, ruining the entire point of the game, but in his defense, it's safe to say everybody would go full manic irrational if they were Vader's main priority. Fun, lore crucial, and cool looking, there's nothing particularly wrong with these fights, more so they could have been much better.
Two words: force slow. This otherwise climactic final duel between Cal and the second sister becomes almost comedic if you realize that Trilla is none too skilled at avoiding this move. It's still an entertaining way to cap off their rivalry, don't get me wrong, but they really should have just made her and all other Force users immune to this in our opinion. Of course, using Force slow is optional, but it's sort of like parrying Gwyn in Dark Souls where you don't really have to do it, but everyone just kinda does. I fought her without abusing it too hard for the sake of getting a fair idea of the fight as well as making it more entertaining to watch, but know that it's far too viable of a method for what's basically the final boss. She has traditional swings, but also picked up some snazzier moves like lightsaber throwing in the short amount of time between this fight and the encounter in the Bogano Vault. Seriously, when did she learn these new moves? Maybe she was just holding out earlier, I don't know. Glad she did learn this stuff though, since it definitely raises this final encounter beyond the heights of the last one. She's got some relatively easy to dodge unblockable moves that provide a good window to hit her afterwards, which is nice. Of course, no lightsaber duel would be complete without the obligatory button-mashing sword clash quicktime event, which for some reason is kicked off by a flashbang. Maybe Trilla was hanging out with the Brood recently. She also adds a shockwave to her arsenal that you need to jump over, which I was sort of accustomed to at this point, but I still think was poorly introduced in this game. No one has attacks that ask this of you until Gargara, which is pretty late in the game, so if you're anything like me, it never even occurred to you to try jumping over these. Ideally, an enemy outside of a boss fight would do this and tell the player that they can expect this to be a thing that happens, and then a boss fight would maybe build on it in some way. It's still pretty rare, so I was a little taken by surprise when Trilla did this. But as is, Trilla is a fun and satisfying finale for the game that's simply overshadowed by more unique and engaging encounters.
In truth, Gargara is a multi-phased fight, but the majority of the time with her is spent in her cave, plus it's the only full-on combat section in nature, hence why she's outside the top 3. She has decent moveset variety and also features mid-fight buffs in the works, but generally nothing changes. I'd say the most infamous portion of this phase is the Earthquake. Like Alex just mentioned, there was no prep or warning for a shockwave mechanic, so for a suddenly introduced move to not only be so high damage but hard to visualize and time as well is less a dock on Gargara and more the overall game. She's also got a limb mechanic similar to Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3. Certain moves leave her open to wing shots, and after a while she gets dropped into a force pull opening that then leads to a small window for headshots. Once she gets down to 20-ish% health, she'll leave for good, or rather just wait outside for 30 seconds only to go at you again. At least this time they did a good job introducing a new mechanic, that being the climbing claws. During my first fight, and like I'm assuming many other players did as well, I instinctually jumped to climb as fast as possible. Don't do this, rather make use of the newly obtained tool. You actually make more ground by simply going up and avoiding the falling rocks than you used to without the claws. In this phase, these mega boulders come crashing down on Gargara and sliver out some health, but the real blows come in the final section. Whee! 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 It's not that fun. Well, it is on the initial jump, but otherwise it's the same motion over and over, and that last one is really damn hard for some reason. I personally find it lame how little you actually do in this section. A quicktime event to stab her in the head like it's Shadow of the Colossus would have been so much cooler than her dying from banging her head on some branches. And by the way, her head can withstand a lightsaber and condo-sized boulders, but not tree trunks? Call it whatever you want, but I'm going with lazy design. All in all, it's just a goofy ending to a great boss, so really there's no shame. Gargara is fantastic, and she can be proud, or I guess would have been proud to know she's the sole beast boss done right.
When you first see this old guy lurking around the nightmare ruins on Dathomir, you probably didn't think much of him, let alone that he'd be a force wielder. So I was pleasantly surprised when they revealed he was a dark Jedi, and that of course we'd have to take him down. This fight is sort of like how I wish the final match with Trilla Siduri was. Force attacks are virtually useless here, and it's an all-around parry fest, which is fun. It's mostly based around breaking his guard and double lightsaber slashing the hell out of him whenever he slips up. He won't take punishment lying down, however, and will force push you away to gain his bearings after you whack him enough. He's also got a lightsaber throw which can really drain your block stamina if you don't time it right. This keeps up until he gets to half health, where he pins you down with some force technique and Marin shows up to help you out. This makes the fight a little easier, but they handled it really well in my opinion. Having her constantly aggroing him would really mess up the balance of this fight, so they wisely just have her chime in with magic moves every now and then to help you out, and during all the quick time lightsaber clashes, she'll slip in and attack at the end. This is great because it still feels like she's fighting along with you, but it retains the one-on-one feeling and doesn't feel like you're totally ganking him, which would have been boring. Malicos gets some new tricks in Phase 2 as well, so it's not just you who gets a buff. Now he flings rocks around at you, which you can either dodge or cancel him out of by hitting him mid-attack and breaking his focus. He's also got an unblockable jump attack, which like most other unblockables isn't too hard to strafe and punish afterwards. Terran Malicos is a great example of a lightsaber duel done right, earning him a solid slot in the top 3.
The Ninth Sister is one of the few thoroughly well-made Inquisitors. I'd say she shares this honor with the Grand Inquisitor, Fifth Brother, and Seventh Sister from Rebels. All 4 have storied character arcs, beautiful design, unique qualities, and in terms of the Ninth Sister, is about as perfect as lightsaber combat can get in a video game. The Ninth Sister, or previously Jedi Knight Masana Teed, was a survivor of Palpatine's Order 66 and when found was taken into the Emperor's Inquisitorius program. She was then tortured on Fortress Inquisitorius on Nur into becoming the Ninth Sister of the Imperial Inquisition. Not much is known about her otherwise, but in Vader Dark Lord of the Sith 16, she personally aided Vader along with the 6th and 10th brothers on a mission to Mon Cala shortly before being assigned to hunt down Cal. At first glance on Braca, she was terrifying. Though logically, why didn't she just kill Cal right then and there? Instead of playing it safe, she fell for the golden rule of Star Wars. Never, ever assume the person who just plunged down a comically large number of feet is dead. Back to Nueve, I had never seen a Force wielder that large and I was hoping to get the chance to face off with her. And when that time came, boy, was it awesome. One thing I was worried about was that she would break power scaling due to her natural size and strength. In terms of Force users, the Inquisitors are about equal to or a bit less powerful than a Jedi Knight with the exception of the Grand Inquisitor, and to my surprise, the Ninth Sister followed course. She's got a handful of fast but dodgeable attacks, and most of her close-range lightsaber swings are easily parried. She's probably too easy, but the extreme health pool makes up for it, I'd say. It's also cool how as the fight goes on, the Ninth Sister grows both more cocky and desperate. Take how she activates the bottom of her Inquisitor saber while calling Cal a piece of garbage to start Phase 2. This changes the entire look of her moveset. She gains the awesome lightsaber throw, new unblockables, and additional lightsaber quick times. After the second Phase 2 quick time, she loses the majority of her remaining health, and from there it's smooth sailing. Just stay locked in and enjoy that awesome ending cutscene. By the way, people underestimate the willpower of a Darkside Force user, and seeing the Ninth Sister still aggressively push for the kill after having an arm chopped was awesome. In the comics, this type of mental conditioning was expected in Inquisitor training. One time Vader even sliced off the arm of the 6th brother, then about as cool as usual stated, "It's only an arm." And also, by the way, how ironic is it that Cal did the exact same thing the Ninth Sister did to him on Braca? To be fair, if Mace Windu couldn't survive a couple hundred feet down to Coruscant's underworld, no shot in Inquisitors surviving a drop from the origin tree. For good storytelling's sake, I hope she's dead, and while the death wasn't as dramatic as I'd hoped, who cares? The fight was about as perfect as it can get and deserves the placement and praise it received.
We know this isn't exactly a boss fight and more of a sequence, but it's too awesome to ignore. Even though it's basically just a bunch of cutscenes and quick-time events, it's still in our joint opinion the best boss in the game. For starters, they absolutely nailed the atmosphere this fight should have. They did a great job of establishing just how powerful the Dark Lord of the Sith is. At this point, he's an intergalactic boogeyman that's so terrifying people don't even entirely believe he exists. So it's suitably fitting seeing Trilla's face turn from shock to horror, and finally just trying to keep her composure once she realizes she's gonna die. I'd also be pissing my tidy whities if I knew Darth Vader wasn't happy with my work and was also right behind me. Of course, Cere is enraged at this and tries rushing him, only to be effortlessly pimp-slapped off the edge by Vader's incredible force power. The game even messes with you by making it seem like you're gonna fight Darth Vader, which goes about as well as it should, and Cal finds himself getting force choked to death about 2 seconds in. I'm glad that you don't actually fight him, since it'd be dumb as hell if Cal was able to hold his own at all against Vader, so this display of strength was definitely the way to go. This and the ending to Rogue One are Jack and I's personal favorite examples of Vader just dunking on people without exerting any effort at all. Take this part where he sends a bunch of floor paneling at you. He's not even trying and he's still tearing shit up. Running away from him is genuinely stressful, and that part in the elevator stands out a lot for that reason. I can't think of a worse time to be waiting on a slowly closing elevator door than when Darth Vader is trying to kill you. Of course, the game even fakes you out by making you think you've escaped him, only for him to pop up on the other side of a door. This I can excuse, I mean it's Darth Vader, of course he can do that. What I don't get is how Seer managed to make her way out of her lava bath. I think it's kinda dumb that she survived, that's the only thing I'd point to as a negative in this encounter. Having BD shock Vader was a neat and creative way to escape an otherwise pretty bad pinch. I also liked Vader flipping Cal's lightsaber around, that was badass right there. Watching Vader just demolish Seer with one hand was also great. And this flies under the radar a lot since the game doesn't focus on it much, but if you notice here at the end, Vader literally holds back an entire planet's worth of water from flooding the room. Like a whole ocean. That's f***ing insane. And the guy doesn't even seem to be struggling to do it. It's just one cool thing after another here. Despite not being a traditional boss fight, the pure intensity and badassery of this sequence takes this above any other part of the game for us.
Thank you guys for tuning in. We've been wanting to do this for a while since we're both major Star Wars nerds. We love talking about it, and a game like Fallen Order for us was like a match made in heaven. I personally can't wait to see what the sequel brings to the table, and while I don't know what you're gonna do, who you're gonna fight, or really anything at all, I'm confident it could best the original. Also, making a short video after back-to-back nearly hour-long pieces was a nice break. Still, we hope you guys enjoyed, and remember to check back in next week for a ranking of the bosses of Cuphead from worst to best. I think you'll be surprised by our list. Anyways, if you haven't already, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't, and with that said, deuces.